The photograph arrived at the Pennsylvania Historical Archives in a cardboard box marked Estate of Helen Morrison Miscellaneous in March 2024. Among dozens of mundane family snapshots and documents was a formal portrait that immediately caught the attention of Dr. Sarah Brennan, the archive specialist in early 20th century photography. The image showed a woman in mourning, photographed in what appeared to be late 1910 based on the style of photography and the woman's clothing. She sat in a wooden chair against a plain backdrop, dressed entirely in black as was customary for widows of the era. Her dress was simple but well-made, suggesting modest but respectable circumstances. A black veil covered her hair, and her expression conveyed the kind of profound sadness that needs no performance. Everything about the image spoke of grief and loss. The woman's posture was rigid, her shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Her face, though partially shadowed by the veil, showed signs of recent tears. The photographer had captured her in a moment of raw sorrow, the kind that often characterized mourning portraits from that period. But when Dr. Brennan examined the photograph more closely under magnification, she noticed something that transformed the entire image from a simple mourning portrait into something far more complex and disturbing. In the widow's lap, partially concealed by the folds of her black dress, she held an object that shouldn't have been there. It was a revolver. The weapon was small, likely a .32 caliber pocket pistol common in that era, its dark metal blending almost perfectly with the woman's black mourning dress. The positioning was deliberate, carefully arranged so the gun was barely visible in the photograph. One hand rested naturally in her lap, but closer examination revealed her fingers were wrapped around the pistol's grip. The other hand lay across her lap in a way that partially obscured the weapon from casual view. Dr. Brennan felt a chill run through her. She had examined thousands of mourning portraits during her career. Victorian and Edwardian mourning photography followed strict conventions. Subjects dressed in black, positioned in formal poses, often holding photographs of the deceased or symbolic items like flowers or Bibles. But she had never seen a mourning portrait where the widow held a weapon. The photograph bore no identifying marks on the front, no photographer's stamp, no studio name embossed in the corner. The back of the image had a faded inscription in pencil. E.M. Pittsburgh, November 1910. 3 pieces of information that should have made identification straightforward, but Dr. Brennan's initial searches through Pittsburgh city records and newspapers from that period yielded nothing obvious. She began examining the other materials in the estate box more carefully. Most were routine documents, property deeds, receipts, letters about mundane family matters. But tucked into an envelope marked Personal Private were newspaper clippings from November and December 1910, all from Pittsburgh newspapers. The first clipping was dated November 3rd, 1910. The headline read, "Tragic Death at Steel Mill, Worker Killed in Foundry Accident." The brief article described how Edmund Morrison, age 34, had died when molten steel spilled during a pour at the Carnegie Steel Works. He had been killed instantly, leaving behind a wife Elizabeth and 3 young children. The second clipping, dated November 18th, provided an update. The steel company had determined the accident was caused by worker negligence and declined to provide any compensation to the widow beyond Morrison's final week's wages. Elizabeth Morrison had appealed the decision, claiming the accident was caused by faulty equipment and inadequate safety measures, but the company's determination stood. She had been left essentially destitute, responsible for 3 children with no income and no prospects. The third clipping changed everything. Dated December 12, 1910, the headline read, "Violence at Steel Company Headquarters. Widow Confronts Management." Dr. Brennan read the article with growing understanding. Elizabeth Morrison had gone to the Carnegie Steel Works administrative offices on December 11th, demanding to speak with the management about her husband's death and the denial of compensation. When she was refused entry and told to leave, she had pulled a revolver from her coat. The article described chaotic scenes as Morrison forced her way past clerks and into the office of the plant superintendent, John Caldwell. She had held the gun on him for nearly 20 minutes, demanding he admit the company's responsibility for her husband's death and provide proper compensation for her family. Police were summoned, and Morrison was eventually arrested without firing the weapon. But the most significant detail came in the article's final paragraphs. Before her arrest, Morrison had told the assembled crowd of workers and police that she had commissioned a photograph of herself holding the weapon that very morning. She had arranged for copies to be sent to newspapers and reform organizations. "I want them to see what a widow looks like when she has been driven to desperation," she had told reporters. "I want them to see what grief looks like when it turns to rage." Dr. Brennan sat back, the photograph taking on entirely new meaning. This wasn't a traditional mourning portrait. This was a deliberate political statement, a visual declaration of desperation and defiance. Elizabeth Morrison had used the conventions of mourning photography, symbols of grief and loss that Victorian society understood and respected, but had subverted them by including the weapon. The image said, "I am a grieving widow, but I am also someone who has been driven to violence by injustice. Look at my sorrow, but also look at what I am prepared to do." Dr. Brennan began researching Elizabeth Morrison's fate more thoroughly. She found additional newspaper coverage of the incident and the subsequent legal proceedings. Morrison had been charged with attempted assault and making terroristic threats. Her trial in January 1911 had attracted significant attention from labor reform advocates and women's rights organizations. The trial transcripts, which Dr. Brennan located in county court archives, revealed Morrison's testimony in heartbreaking detail. She described her husband's death, the company's refusal to take responsibility, her desperate attempts to find work while caring for 3 children under the age of 8. She explained that she had purchased a revolver with borrowed money, intending to force the company to hear her grievances. "I did not go there to kill anyone," Morrison had testified. "I went there to make them see me, to make them acknowledge what they had done. For weeks, I had been invisible to them, just another widow they could dismiss. But with that gun in my hand, they could not look away." She had commissioned the photograph, she explained, because she wanted evidence of her desperation preserved. She wanted people to understand that she was not a criminal or a madwoman, but a grieving wife and desperate mother driven to extreme measures by a system that valued profit over human life. The photograph had indeed been sent to reform organizations and newspapers. Dr. Brennan found references to it in labor movement publications from 1911 and 1912. It had been reprinted in pamphlets advocating for worker safety laws and employer liability reform. Morrison's image had become a symbol of the human cost of industrial accidents and corporate indifference. The trial had ended with a surprising verdict. The jury, composed entirely of working-class men who likely understood Morrison's circumstances intimately, had acquitted her of all charges. The judge had been furious, but the verdict stood. Morrison walked free, though her photograph and her story had made her notorious. Dr. Brennan found additional photographs in the state box, images of Elizabeth Morrison taken in subsequent years. In one from 1912, she stood among a group of women at a labor reform rally, holding a sign demanding workplace safety legislation. In another from 1915, she appeared on a podium, apparently giving a speech at a workers' rights convention. The desperate widow from the 1910 portrait had transformed into an activist, using her experience and her notoriety to advocate for change. Dr. Brennan found newspaper articles describing Morrison's work organizing widows of industrial accident victims, helping them navigate legal systems and demand compensation. She had become a speaker at labor rallies, her story used to illustrate the need for stronger safety regulations and employer responsibility. Dr. Brennan's research revealed that Elizabeth Morrison's photograph and subsequent activism had contributed to a broader movement for industrial safety reform in the 1910s. The image of the grieving widow holding a weapon had become iconic in labor circles, reproduced in pamphlets and displayed at rallies. She found letters Morrison had written to various reform organizations in 1911 and 1912. In one addressed to the National Consumers League, Morrison explained her reasoning behind the photograph. "Society expects widows to be quiet in our grief, to accept our circumstances with dignity and resignation. But what dignity is there in watching your children go hungry because a company values machinery more than men?" I wanted that photograph to show both things, my grief, which was real and profound, and my rage, which was equally justified. The photograph had sparked significant controversy. Conservative newspapers had condemned it as unseemly and inappropriate. arguing that Morrison's actions demonstrated the dangers of women becoming involved in public affairs. But progressive publications had defended it as a powerful statement about industrial injustice. Jane Addams, the famous social reformer, had written about Morrison's case in a 1911 essay. Dr. Brennan located the piece in the Hull House archives. Addams had described the photograph as a visual embodiment of the desperation felt by countless working-class women who watched their husbands destroyed by industrial labor and then find themselves abandoned by the very companies that profited from that labor. The photograph had also caught the attention of Lewis Hine, the pioneering documentary photographer known for his images of child labor and working conditions. Dr. Brennan found correspondence between Hine and Morrison in the estate papers. Hine had written to Morrison in 1912, praising her use of photography as a tool for social justice. "Your portrait demonstrates something I have long believed," Hine wrote, "that photographs can do more than document reality. They can challenge it. You took the conventional form of mourning photography and transformed it into a weapon more powerful than the revolver you held. That image has done more to advance the cause of workers' safety than 1,000 speeches could have accomplished." Morrison had responded with her own insights about the photograph's creation. She described how carefully she had planned every detail, choosing a photographer known for his technical skill and his sympathy with working-class causes. She had positioned the revolver deliberately, visible enough to be shocking, but concealed enough that viewers would have to look closely, forcing them to engage with the image rather than dismiss it immediately. "I wanted people to see me first as a widow, to feel the sadness before they saw the anger," Morrison had written. "I wanted them to understand that these two things cannot be separated, that my grief and my rage come from the same source, the unnecessary death of my husband and the abandonment of my family." The photograph had been displayed at a major exhibition on industrial conditions in New York in 1913. Contemporary newspaper coverage described crowds gathering around it, discussing its meaning and implications. Some viewers have been disturbed by the juxtaposition of mourning imagery with violence. Others had seen it as a justified response to systematic injustice. Dr. Brennan traced Morrison's activism through the 1910s and 1920s. She had become a prominent figure in the movement for workers' compensation laws, testifying before state legislatures about the need for mandatory employer insurance for workplace injuries and deaths. Her photograph often accompanied articles about these testimonies, its impact undiminished by repetition. By 1915, Pennsylvania had passed comprehensive workers' compensation legislation. While many factors contributed to this reform, historians of the labor movement credited Morrison's case and her subsequent activism as significant catalysts. Her story had personalized abstract arguments about industrial safety, giving the movement a human face and a powerful narrative. Dr. Brennan found evidence that Morrison had helped hundreds of other widows navigate the new compensation systems. Letters in the state papers showed her corresponding with women across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, advising them on how to file claims and challenge company denials. She had essentially created an informal network of support for industrial accident widows, using her notoriety and experience to help others. The estate papers also revealed Morrison's personal struggles during these years. Raising 3 children alone while maintaining an activist career had been extremely difficult. Letters to friends described financial hardships, health problems, and the constant challenge of balancing motherhood with public advocacy. In one particularly poignant letter from 1916, Morrison wrote, "People see me on platforms giving speeches, and they think I am strong and fearless. They don't see me at night, when the children are asleep, when I look at Edmund's photograph and weep for what we lost. They don't see the desperation that still lives inside me, the anger that never quite goes away." That photograph from 1910 captured something true. I am both the grieving widow and the woman with the weapon. I will always be both. Dr. Brennan discovered that Morrison had remarried in 1918 to a union organizer named Thomas Brennan. Together they had continued advocacy work, focusing on labor rights and industrial safety. The estate papers suggested it had been a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect, quite different from Morrison's first marriage to Edmund, which had been cut short so tragically. Photographs from the 1920s showed Morrison at various labor events, often standing beside her second husband, both of them holding signs or addressing crowds. Her 3 children from her first marriage appeared in some images, grown into teenagers and young adults who seemed to have followed their mother's example of activism. The Depression years brought new challenges. Letters from the 1930s described Morrison's work helping unemployed workers and their families navigate relief programs. Now in her 50s, she had become an elder stateswoman of the labor movement, her story from 1910 still invoked as an example of righteous resistance against corporate power. Dr. Brennan found a particularly interesting document from 1935, a speech Morrison had given at a labor union conference. In it, she reflected on the photograph that had made her famous 25 years earlier. "That image has followed me throughout my life," Morrison told the audience. "People ask me if I regret it, if I wish I had not posed with that weapon, had not taken such a dramatic action. But I tell them this: desperate times require desperate measures." The photograph was shocking because it needed to be. Polite requests and proper channels had failed. Sometimes you must force people to really see, the human cost of their policies and practices. She had gone on to discuss how the photograph had been both a burden and a gift. It had marked her as controversial, made her a target for criticism from those who believed women should remain quiet and submissive, but it had also given her a platform, made her story impossible to ignore, opened doors that would have remained closed to an ordinary widow. "I have spent 25 years living up to that photograph," Morrison said. Living up to the courage it implied, the defiance it represented. Some days that has been exhausting, but it has also been purposeful, meaningful in ways my life might not have been otherwise. Edmund died for nothing, killed by negligence and greed. But I made his death mean something. That photograph helped me do that. Dr. Brennan traced Morrison's life through World War II and into the 1950s. She had lived to see many of the reforms she had fought for become standard practice. Workers' compensation, safety regulations, employer liability. These were now accepted principles, though implementation remained imperfect. Elizabeth Morrison died in 1956 at age 80. Her obituary in the Pittsburgh newspapers described her as a pioneer of workers' rights and tireless advocate for industrial safety reform. The obituary included a reproduction of the famous 1910 photograph, still powerful nearly half a century later. Dr. Brennan organized an exhibition at the Pennsylvania Historical Archives in September 2024 titled "Grief and Defiance: The Photographs and Activism of Elizabeth Morrison." The 1910 mourning portrait was displayed prominently as the exhibition centerpiece, accompanied by extensive historical context and Morrison's own words explaining its creation. The exhibition explored how Morrison had used photography not just as documentation, but as a form of protest and political expression. It examined the broader context of early 20th century industrial accidents, the lack of safety regulations, and the corporate practices that left widows and families destitute. Display cases contain original newspaper clippings, letters, photographs, and documents tracing Morrison's transformation from desperate widow to prominent activist. Visitors could read her testimony from the 1911 trial, see reproductions of labor reform pamphlets that featured her image, and learn about the legislative changes her activism had helped achieve. One section of the exhibition focused specifically on the photograph itself, analyzing its composition, symbolism, and strategic use of conventional mourning imagery. Dr. Brennan had written extensive interpretive text explaining how Morrison had deliberately worked within and against Victorian mourning conventions to create something both familiar and shocking. The black dress, the veil, the expression profound sadness, all these elements told viewers they were looking at a proper mourning portrait, the text explained. Only upon closer examination did they discover the revolver, transforming the image from traditional grief into something far more complex, a visual declaration that suffering can become resistance, that mourning can transform into action. The exhibition attracted significant media attention. Several major newspapers ran features about Morrison's story, and the photograph went viral on social media, sparking discussions about historical activism, women's resistance, and the power of images to drive social change. Many visitors were descendants of early 20th century industrial workers who had their own family stories of workplace accidents and struggles for compensation. They left comments in the exhibition guest book describing how Morrison's story resonated with their own family histories. One visitor, a woman named Margaret Lewis, spent nearly an hour at the exhibition before approaching Dr. Brennan. She explained that her great-grandfather had worked at the same Carnegie Steel Works where Edmund Morrison died. He had survived his years there, but had lost several friends to accidents. My great-grandfather kept a clipping of his photograph on his workshop wall for decades, Lewis told Dr. Brennan. I remember seeing it as a child and asking him about it. He told me it was a picture of the bravest woman he ever knew of, someone who fought back when everyone expected her to accept her suffering quietly. He said it reminded him that ordinary people could stand up to powerful institutions. Another visitor, Thomas Morrison, no relation to Elizabeth, explained that his grandfather had served on the jury that acquitted Elizabeth Morrison in 1911. My grandfather talked about that trial until the day he died, he said. He said every man on that jury understood exactly why she had done what she did. They all knew men who had been killed or injured in industrial accidents. They all knew widows who had been left with nothing. They couldn't convict her because they knew the real criminals were the company executives who valued profit over human life. The exhibition included a section on the broader impact of Morrison's activism and photograph. Display boards showed newspaper articles about legislative reforms, excerpts from speeches by other activists who had cited Morrison's example, and photographs of subsequent labor protests where her image appeared on signs and banners. Dr. Brennan had also located several academic papers analyzing the photograph from various perspectives. Art historians discussed its subversion of Victorian visual conventions. Labor historians examined its role in galvanizing the workers' rights movement. Women's studies scholars explored how it represented early feminist resistance, using traditionally feminine spaces, mourning photography, as sites of political action. One particularly insightful analysis came from Professor of Visual Culture who wrote, Morrison's photograph operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It is genuinely a mourning portrait, documenting real grief for a real loss. But it is also a threat, a promise of violence if justice is not achieved. It is a political statement, a piece of propaganda, and a personal catharsis. This multiplicity of meaning is what gives it such enduring power. The exhibition also explored Morrison's later life and the evolution of her activism. Photographs from the 1920s through 1950s showed her at various events, aging but apparently never losing her intensity or commitment. Letters and speeches revealed how her thinking developed over decades of advocacy work. In a particularly moving section, the exhibition displayed photographs Morrison had kept of her children growing up. Images showed them as toddlers in the years immediately after their father's death, then as teenagers in the 1920s, and finally as adults with children of their own. Accompanying text explained how Morrison had always been open with her children about their father's death and her subsequent activism. One of Morrison's daughters, Catherine, had become a labor lawyer, using legal tools to achieve the kinds of reforms her mother had fought for through direct action. Her son, Edmund Jr., had become a safety inspector, dedicating his career to preventing the kinds of accidents that had killed his father. Her youngest child, Helen, had worked as a social worker helping families navigate workers' compensation systems. In many ways, all three children spent their lives continuing their mother's work, Dr. Brennan explained in the exhibition text. They channeled the grief and anger Elizabeth Morrison had expressed in that 1910 photograph into professional careers dedicated to worker protection and family support. The photograph's impact extended across generations. The exhibition concluded with a powerful final section exploring the photograph's contemporary relevance. Dr. Brennan had included statistics on current workplace deaths and injuries, information about ongoing fights for worker protections, and stories of modern activists continuing Morrison's legacy. Elizabeth Morrison's photograph asks us to consider what we do when institutional systems fail. The concluding text read, when proper channels refuse to acknowledge injustice, when grief is met with indifference, when desperate people are left with no legitimate recourse. More than a century later, these questions remain urgent. The photograph endures not as a historical curiosity, but as a continuing challenge. What will you do when you encounter injustice? Will you accept it quietly, or will you find ways, as Morrison did, to force the powerful to see and acknowledge the suffering they cause? Dr. Brennan gave multiple talks during the exhibition period, discussing Morrison's life and the photograph's significance. She emphasized that while Morrison's specific tactics were products of her particular moment, the broader strategy of using visual imagery to dramatize injustice remained relevant. "We live in an age of images," Dr. Brennan told one audience. "Photographs and videos shape public opinion, drive social movements, force conversations that powerful institutions would prefer to avoid." Morrison understood this instinctively in 1910. She created an image that couldn't be ignored, that forced viewers to confront uncomfortable truths. That's a lesson that resonates strongly today, when social media allows images to reach millions of people instantly. Several journalists asked Dr. Brennan whether she thought Morrison would face more serious consequences if she had been a man or a person of color. Dr. Brennan acknowledged this was likely true, explaining that Morrison had benefited from certain privileges even in her desperation. As a white woman, Morrison could access sympathy in ways that would have been denied to others, Dr. Brennan said. The jury that acquitted her was composed of white working-class men who could identify with her as someone from their community. That doesn't diminish her courage or the significance of her actions, but it does require us to think critically about whose resistance gets celebrated and whose gets punished. Many people of color engaged in similar acts of resistance during this period and face far harsher consequences. The exhibition ran for 6 months, attracting over 50,000 visitors. It generated enough interest that the Pennsylvania Historical Archives created a permanent display featuring Morrison's photograph and selected materials from her papers. The image has been digitized and made freely available online, allowing it to reach new audiences. For Dr. Brennan, the exhibition confirmed something she had long believed about historical photographs. They are never simply windows into the past. They are constructions, creations, deliberate choices about what to show and how to show it. Elizabeth Morrison had understood this, had used photography deliberately and strategically to advance her cause. "When I first saw that photograph," Dr. Brennan reflected in the exhibition catalog, "I was struck by its strangeness, by the jarring presence of the revolver in what should have been a conventional mourning portrait. But as I learned Morrison's story, I came to see the photograph as a perfect expression of her situation and her response to it. She was genuinely grieving, genuinely devastated by her husband's death, but she was also angry, defiant, unwilling to accept injustice quietly. The photograph captured both truths simultaneously, refusing to separate the personal grief from the political rage. That's what makes it so powerful, so enduring. It shows us that vulnerability and strength are not opposites, that mourning and resistance can coexist, that sometimes the most powerful political acts come from places of profound personal pain. The photograph remains in the Pennsylvania Historical Archives permanent collection, preserved and protected but also accessible. It continues to be reproduced in textbooks, documentaries, and articles about labor history, women's history, and the power of visual activism. More than a century after Elizabeth Morrison sat for that portrait, holding a revolver beneath the folds of her mourning dress, her image continues to ask uncomfortable questions about justice, power, and resistance. It reminds us that photographs can be more than documentation. They can be declarations, challenges, calls to action. And it preserves the story of one woman who refused to grieve quietly, who transformed her suffering into a weapon more powerful than a gun she held, and who helped change the world for thousands of workers and families who came after her.